If ever you see me driving out in the community and you're behind me and you see me swerve all of a sudden, it's because I've heard a quote on the radio and I'm trying to find a place to pull over and write it down really quick. A couple weeks ago, I heard a quote on the radio, and it was attributed to a science media writer, and I thought it was really amazing, and I added a little bit to it just to kind of spiritualize it a little bit. So the quote goes roughly like this: between this person and me. Deep investigation, resulting in infinite understanding, takes us beyond a reliance on a true or false outlook regarding the inner workings of the universe. So deep investigation, resulting in infinite understanding, takes us beyond a reliance on a true or false outlook regarding the inner workings of the universe. Every single one of us has had the experience of wondering about what is bigger, about what is out there, about some form of power. And I think that most of us can relate to, it comes up for each and every one of us differently, but most of us can relate to the idea of, for example, who lights the stars? What lights the stars? And the universe is so gorgeous around us. The sun rises, the sun sets, the various seasons. There isn't a single season that doesn't have its own beauty. There isn't a single place on this planet that doesn't in some way, shape, or form have its own beauty. A beauty that seems to be natural, a beauty that seems to be at times absolutely breathtaking. I like the idea of the concept of breathtaking. To look at something and move beyond the idea of defining it and just simply to take it in. And sometimes those things that we encounter, that we experience, will move us to tears, or they will move us to a spontaneous smile. Now, I was thinking a lot about really great music because we have Alan here and he's such a great musician, and the times that we have just heard someone play a musical instrument so incredibly well that we're left speechless, or that touches something that is deep within us, that special place. Throughout all of time, I don't even know if I believe in time because of the idea of the eternality of the universe, but throughout the eons and down through the ages, we as human beings and our ancestors and whatever branch of whatever they were in terms of their evolution and evolving, I think we have always taken time to stop no matter what we're doing. Whether we were hunting an animal, harvesting a crop, grinding grain, attending to those that we love, at some point there was something that caused us to pause and to stop and to see what is it that is so gorgeous. But see, we as human beings, we don't just take it in. Then we have this tendency to stop and to wonder and to think and to speculate and to have a conversation and to use our imagination. And that has been really what has made us great, to use our imagination. But what's really interesting? Psychology says that there are two distinct times in our lives, not distinct years necessarily, but two times in our life as a human being where something very special takes place. The first time in our life where that takes place is in our adolescence. And it doesn't come about all at once. It comes about over time. And most of us think of our adolescence as somewhere in the teenage years, going up sometime to even in our 20s. Some people push it to 30. That's what I did, I loved my adolescence, so I pushed it, And adolescence is a time that what psychology says, it's a time about developing very personal ideas and very personal truths that are ours, all mine. Not my mom's, not my dad's. We call it that time of rebellion. It's about grabbing a hold of something. And this idea about the true or false mentality made me think about that. Because adolescents are looking for true and false statements, not necessarily about the religion or the culture. Sometimes they're brought about through rebellion. In fact, very often they are. But an adolescent loves to walk around and say things like, and I'm going to date myself by saying this, but, the Beatles are better than the Rolling Stones. Coke is better than Pepsi. Red is better than blue. Or, to put it in the language of my granddaughter Emma, she would say, the Beatles are the best, true or false? The Rolling Stones are the best, true or false? Pepsi is better, true or false? My brother's a butt face, true or false? Yeah. After a while, when you're away from kids for a while and they don't know you really well and you have to get to know them again or whatever, it takes some time to warm up. After a while, you should hear the things they were saying about me, true or false. That was kind of embarrassing. They were coming out of the back seat of the car. So that's what we do. We find a truth. We as human beings have been obsessed with defining things and being able to put them in a box. So our earliest ancestors, our very earliest ancestors, going back whatever, okay, they went out and they gazed at the stars and they looked around them and they began to contemplate this idea of a power. Something that, for lack of a better term, as we come down to, today we call it God. And I apologize. I know some of you don't like the G word. I'm dropping G bombs today, right? We're going to talk about God. So for lack of a better term, we called it God. And so they started out and they looked around and they were trying to figure out, okay, how does this whole thing work? And they were drawn to the feminine. And they were drawn to the feminine because as they looked around in their villages, their settlements, as they looked around nature, what they saw was that the feminine was what brought forth life. They were captivated by that. There was some kind of magic about that. Joseph Campbell in his work talks about the great cathedrals that we have. Let's think of, we all pretty much have some idea of the Vatican, this incredible cathedral with the Sistine Chapel and all that stuff. Joseph Campbell said, that was our way of replicating the great caves that our ancestors used to go into because they thought that was the womb of life. And that's why they went into those caves and they painted animals and they painted people all over the walls of that. And they would go in there for their rites and rituals because they were trying desperately to move inside of the great feminine. And he said the cathedrals that we went on to build later on were just replications of that. In other words, a place where we would walk in and we would be completely awe-inspired by the idea of giving forth life. And that was important to our ancestors because it was the very nature of the animals they hunted and the grains that they harvested and their subsistence cultures, whether it was the acorns or whatever it was important for them to be tuned into this idea of life. And so they decided, something else we do as ancestors, something else we do as human beings is we tend to try and categorize something. So, okay, what is God? What is this power? What is this? Well, they started out with the idea of the goddess. All religion started with goddess worship. Literally worshiping the womb. Literally worshiping the feminine. Worshiping the cycles of life that women experience. Because when our ancestors looked at that, they saw the cycles of the feminine. They saw the cycles of nature. And so back then, you would say, God is a goddess, true or false? Okay, well, the answer would be true. Okay, so they could all agree on that. And then one day, I mean that metaphorically, over time, we began to, as human beings, we began to develop things called tribes and government and politics. And we began to not just look at the land as something that we had a relationship with, but it was something we could own. We brought into the idea things like law and things like that. And that's when the guys came along and screwed it all up, you know what I'm saying? The guys got involved. The men got involved. In Barbara Walker's work, her work about the history of spirituality, the history of religion, she'll say, and she's saying this metaphorically, the very first priest was a woman, and the second priest was a man. And that's why she points out that even today, that when the Pope comes out, he's dressed in a dress. There's no accident in that. That men who took on the place of priest and king and those kinds of things, men who began to take on the mantle of spiritual teacher or leader or mystic or whatever you want to call it, inhabited the feminine. But the problem was that they began to interject, I wouldn't say the problem is, but they began to interject the idea of the masculine. And so when we developed this idea that now instead of having a relationship with the land, that I own the land and that the land somehow belongs to me, then we began to draw boundaries, we began to create kings and queens, and we began to form armies to defend our land. So God became seen as a father. God became seen as a warrior. God became seen as a king, as something that could protect us and use weapons and put together armies. If we look at the way God was looked at through the Islamic theology, through Judaism, and through Christianity, we begin to see emerge ideas like this. This is from the Islamic theology. God is seen as creator, sustainer, ordainer, and judge. Singular, unique, royal. Okay? It wasn't about creation anymore. It wasn't about the cycles of life. Listen to those words. The creator, the sustainer, the ordainer, the judge. Why? Because we began to embrace things called laws and things like that. So we began to see God as this masculine figure who would rule with weapons, rule with law, and protect us. So we can go to bed at night, we didn't have to worry. And so God began to emerge as a protector. And in Judaism, we see the idea God is the one absolute, the indivisible, the ultimate. But this is important. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that delivered Israel from the slavery in Egypt. Wow. God just took another turn. God actually became a savior. God actually became a personification. God actually became the great Father who delivered us from something. And then Christianity went the next step. Christianity says God is the eternal being who created and preserves the world, being both independent of and immanent in the world. Christianity excludes the belief that God is the same substance as the created universe, but did incarnate as a man in the body of Jesus. And so we began to move into this era, this true and false era. God is a man, true or false? God is the king, true or false? God is the creator, true or false? God is that guy who saved us from slavery, true or false? God is Jesus, true or false? And so we got into an idea that those were the truths. Those ideas sprang from our adolescent times. They sprang from this idea of the adolescent who wants to have everything be concrete and black and white. Now, what's interesting about our movement is that Ernest Holmes, who is our founder and part of New Thought, Ernest Holmes doesn't criticize any of this. He doesn't get upset about it. He says it's part of our evolution. Because Ernest Holmes knew enough about psychology to know that just as people need to go through the stages of psychology, so do all of us. And so Ernest Holmes says, he said, my cell phone is ringing. So, okay. Okay. So Ernest Holmes basically said, if you look at all the great civilization we have, if you look at cell phones, for example, if you look at the architecture and the art and the music and everything that came forward, we somehow needed that kind of concrete thinking to help us bring that forward. Holmes said, why, basically he would say, he and other people in New Thought would basically say, why would we criticize the religious ideas we went through any more than we would criticize a Neanderthal or another part of our human ancestors? When we go into a museum and we see a skeleton or we see a fossil, we don't sit there and criticize it. We don't ridicule it. We say, wow, this is part of who we are. This is part of what we are. But what New Thought also understands, or what we believe, is that around roughly 5,000 years ago, okay? 3, 5, 6,000 years ago, there was something else that happened in terms of our development. And so this brings us to the other thing that we go through as human beings, which is very pivotal for each and every one of us, and we all go through it in some way, shape, or form, is what we've referred to now as the midlife crisis. And what the midlife crisis basically says is, what is my meaning? What has been the meaning of my life? What is my meaning today? And how will I be remembered? Now, we don't see the midlife crisis in our culture show up that way. We see it show up sometimes where suddenly a guy who's 55 or 60 will go dye his hair, buy a Corvette, divorce his wife, move to Mexico. It becomes a joke. Or if someone does something really amazing or extraordinary, out of the ordinary, they're having a midlife crisis. But the midlife crisis is about meaning. And meaning takes us beyond true or false. Because the thing that happens in our midlife, when we look at our life, when we look back at our life, are we comfortable with saying, my life was good, true or false? My life was bad, true or false? Not really. We look back and we say it's a mixed bag. We look back and we say, wow, there's some things that were challenging. And there were some things that maybe I made some mistakes in. And maybe I wasn't the best employee, or maybe that career move wasn't so great, or maybe I wasn't the best parent, or maybe that second or third marriage wasn't so hot. But, I learned something from it. It means that there's something more to me. I heard Elton John interviewed recently, and Elton John came out with an album just recently. I think it's called The Diving Board. We all know Elton John, that outrageous, over-the-top showman, who would, he took Liberace to the stratosphere. I mean, his concerts and his, he would dress himself up in neon lights and all this kind of stuff. And he produced music that was very top 10 oriented, and he was very much a part of that, very over the top. And he produced this album called The Diving Board, which is all acoustic. It's a very quiet album. It's ballads. It's very deep, meaningful kinds of ideas. He has one song where the song is about, it starts out, spend some time with the old folks, trying to gain some wisdom. And the song is about, because he's British, in terms of us being American, we share this experience of World War II, the veterans, what happened in World War II. And the song is about, I want to go spend some time with these people who are in World War II, who are now leaving, so I can get some wisdom. I mean, that's not Benny and the Jets, you know what I'm saying? And he talks about the fact, they said, wow, this album is really different. He says, well, look at my age. I mean, come on. Really? You want me to do neon lights again? I mean, I'm reflective. I'm thinking. I'm wondering about meaning. I'm wondering if my life had meaning. I'm wondering if it has meaning today. And I'm wondering how I'll be remembered. And I wonder about my relationships. Elton John is really interesting. He has two parents. Both his parents were World War II generation, but his mom is the veteran. She was an anti-aircraft gunner in London, and his father didn't serve. And so he says, my mom she shot down German airplanes. He said, if you knew her, you would get it. That's the way she is. He says, I grew up always knowing that's what she would be about because it doesn't surprise me that she manned an anti-aircraft gun because that's my mom. And so during the time, and I want to, I went to Islam and I went to Judaism and I went to Christianity, but you have to understand that during the time that they were coming of age and during the time that they were moving forward, there were also strains of them that we would call, say, mysticism. New Thought is considered a mystical philosophy. What do we mean by mysticism? We mean the idea that true or false doesn't really fit a definition of God. God is a woman, true or false. God is a man, true or false. God is a warrior, true or false. God is a judge, true or false. God is separate from us, true or false. Mysticism, which was growing up in the same time in its own way, started with the feminine ideas and went into a different direction, including Christian mysticism. But I want to give you some examples, and I want to start with some Native American beliefs. And this is something that was articulated by Russell Means, who was a Native American activist and a spiritual leader. He was also an actor. He was a writer. Pretty amazing guy. He was asked one time if he could somehow encapsulate Native American spiritual ideas, especially the idea of God. Now, Russell Means said, well, you have to understand that in the Americas, there were all kinds of nations, all kinds of ideas. And so he tried to encapsulate it as best he could in general terms. And this is what Russell Means said. He said, great spirit or great mystery is personal, close to humankind. But it is also immanent in the fabric of the material world. Though sometimes referred to as grandfather or old man, actually spirit is ultimately genderless and sometimes androgynous. Spirit is also known as the great provider, creator, the revealer of truth, the great sun, S-U-N, the web of creation. You see, that definition doesn't lend itself to a true or false answer. This is why we call it mysticism, because this definition opens us up to the mystery. Ernest Holmes would say, if God is omnipresent, if God is omnipotent, if God is all there is, then how can we possibly define it? That's what Russell Means is saying. In other words, Russell Means is saying, well, this is the best we can do, but you have to understand. I mean, just take the idea of the web of life, the great revealer, and the idea of the sun in terms of not only literally but metaphorically, and what that means to life. How do you put that into a true or false idea? That comes into the idea of meaning. So, what if you asked Buddha what he thought of God? The Buddha, historical Buddha, Siddhartha, rejected the existence of a creator deity, rather emphasizing the systems of causal relationships underlying the universe, basically acknowledging the existence of governing laws that exist throughout every aspect of life. And from what I've read about the historic Buddha, and we know that Buddhism has produced an entire theology and dharma and everything that comes from it. But the Buddha, there is a tradition that someone walked up to Buddha, and said, Buddha, do you believe in God? And Buddha said, that's not really relevant to my life. I mean, I want to love. I want to have compassion. I want to have wisdom. I want to live a meaningful, okay, midlife crisis. I want to live a meaningful life. It's more interesting to me, Buddha would say, to understand how life works. the laws, and those kinds of things. And we know, if you ever do some research and say, so in other words, Buddhism says what about the universe? It would say the universe is ruled by the law of karma, cause and effect. Literally ruled by that. So, how can we meet karma? I mean, how can we put karma on a throne? How can we make karma a woman or a man? How can we take karma into some particular place? Karma is a man, true or false. Karma is a woman, true or false. Karma lives in North America, true or false. Karma lives in Asia, true or false. How do we do that? And then we take that and we say, how does that address meaning in terms of my life? So then we asked Lao Tzu, who is credited with writing the Tao, and I understand Becky last week got into the Tao Te Ching. This is what Lao Tzu would say. Lao Tzu, what do you think about God? And Lao Tzu would say, the Tao, which we in the West sort of loosely translate as God, and I know for the purists that's not really true, but let's just use it that way. So Lao Tzu would say, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. So in other words, the God that can be told is not the eternal God. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The unnameable is the eternal real, with a capital R, the eternal real. Mystery and manifestations arise from the same source. Did you hear that? Mystery and manifestations arise from the same source. And Lao Tzu says, if we can embrace mystery, then we have found the gateway to all understanding. This thing called God, and what's interesting is that for those of us who don't like the G word, in just what we've talked about this morning, look at all the other ideas that have opened up to us. Listen to Russell Means, Listen to the Buddha. Listen to Lao Tzu. The other names that they've introduced. The web of life. The source. The sun, S-U-N. The mystery. The provider. We in New Thought, we don't believe that God fits into a true or false definition. Ernest Holmes would say, well, we needed to go through that. There's a time in every kid's life where they need to know that Coke is better than Pepsi, or the Beatles are better than the Stones, or the drummer is better than the guitarist, or Chevy is better than Ford. There's a time for that. There's a time when we need to know that. But we've moved past that time. We've moved into a time where we see God as so much more. And yet at the same time, we're called upon in some way, shape, or form to assign some sort of meaning to God. What I want to do right now is I want to have you sit back and listen to a song from Kathy Zavada called Who Lights the Stars. And just, if you want to close your eyes, if you don't want to close your eyes, just let this just wash over you for just a moment before we So let's ask Ernest Holmes, who lights the stars. And he says, from his first chapter, there is one energy back of all that is energized. This energy is in everything. There is one spirit back of all expression. That is the meaning of the mystical saying, in God we live and move and have our being, found in the biblical text. It's interesting that Holmes, in this very simple statement, which is basically 3 sentences long, he parses something out very interestingly. He said, there is one energy, and it energizes everything. And then he says, there is one spirit back of all expression. And what we say in New Thought is the Almighty God and the innermost God are one God. And that literally, when we look at the energies that are behind this universe, they are the same energies that course through our veins today. The Almighty God and the innermost God are one God. So how do we define that? We define it by meaning. We define it by mystery. We define it by having a mature idea of how this universe works. But the thing that's the most important part of this parsing out is the idea that, life, I so appreciate where the Buddha is coming from, because basically life is about, I want to show up in a particular way. I want to love, I want to have compassion, I want to be empowered, I want to have wisdom. And so, just as the stars and the planets in this universe draw upon a power to do that, we can draw upon that power as well. We can draw upon that power as well. Even if we don't completely understand it, we still have the ability to draw upon it. And we in this movement, we talk very much about having a relationship with this power. Having a relationship with this energy, this force that is behind the universe, and it is behind us. And we talk about stepping into that relationship. We step into it with intention. We step into it with our belief systems. We step into it by remembering the truth of ourselves, that we are children of the universe. But sometimes we forget that. And so in our movement, we have the cornerstone of prayer, which is what connects us to this idea, to this remembrance. It connects us to this force.